Hello all, just sitting up in my room, spending 15-20 minutes reading a little poetry and thinking that there are so many people in the world who think they hate poetry and would never even consider sitting in their room just reading for 10, 15, 20 minutes for fun. So this video is designed to maybe give you a little guidance in how to make it more successful and therefore less painful. I'm going to recommend that there's 3 different ways you can read a poem. We're going to call it cold reading, warm reading, and hot reading. You could even call it a lazy reading, a moderate reading, and a passionate reading. And I'm going to teach you how to do all 3. And then, quite honestly, based on what you're reading and how much you like it, you get to pick whichever style you prefer. So let's get started. The first encounter with a poem is what I call a cold reading. The only rule is follow the punctuation. I don't care what the lines look like, just follow the punctuation as if you're reading just regular stuff in a paragraph. I also think that reading out loud, even the first try, is a great idea. You don't have to, particularly if you don't want someone to think you've lost your mind sitting in your room with your book of poetry reading to yourself. But at any rate, the only thing you have to do is follow the punctuation. So the poem that we're going to work with today is called "The World is Too Much With Us" by William Wordsworth. So I'm going to demonstrate a cold reading for you. All I'm going to do is pretend it's a paragraph, read it aloud, and just try and make basic, simple, skimmy sense of it. Here we go. The world is too much with us, late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours, and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. This for everything we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. That's it. You read through it and you follow the punctuation. I want to call your attention to something toward the end as a demonstration of how important the punctuation is. If you look at the part that begins with "Great God," notice there is no comma, no dash, no period, no semicolon there at the end of the line. And therefore, I connect that line to the next one like a smooth sentence. It reads, "Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn." Without the pause in the right place, it makes no sense. And the whole purpose of the cold read is just to get, again, a basic, simple, skimmy kind of sense of the poem. It'll let you know, at the very least, whether you like it or not, and whether it's worth your time to move on to a warm read. And now it's time for the warm reading of our poem, which obviously requires a short sleeve shirt and a cool beverage. But even more importantly, it requires a pen, because this is where we have to do our annotations. We're going to take the temperature up, take the effort up, and this is where we do all our English classy stuff, where we make sure that we really grasp the poem. You see, poems are dense in the sense that they have a lot of wonderful things going on in a small space. So there's a lot of artistry packed in there. And we use our pen to help us kind of dig through all the beautiful things that are happening in this small space. So I'm going to give you some really concrete tips, some very specific things you can do with your pen to help you sort through what the poem is trying to communicate to you. Number 1 tip. We are going to use our pen to do slash marks in between the sentences or in between the independent clauses. Once again, just like we did before, following along with the punctuation. So let's get to it. The first most natural place to pause is at that semicolon at us. So I am going to draw a slash mark there. And we've got our first section. The world is too much with us. Do we understand this? Well, since we've already done a cold read and we have a general introductory sense of what the poem is about, I can say, yes, I understand what it means for the world to be too much with us. It means that there's too many worldly things wrapped around us. We're giving our attention to too many worldly things. I might even make a little check mark here at this first clause to let me know that I've kind of mastered that particular clause, and it gives me a sense of accomplishment. I can move on to the next part now. The next most natural place to pause is going to be that colon after the word powers. So again, a slash mark. Now let's read it. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Do we understand this? Yes, I think this makes sense. It's not particularly difficult. I don't even need the dictionary yet. I'm going to put a check mark here. I believe this means that we're focusing on things in the world that have to do with being late or being too soon. Time, the clock, the tick, tick, ticking of the clock is what we're worried about. We're worried about getting and spending, just accumulation of stuff and money. And in doing all these things with money and clocks, we lay waste our powers. Our natural human powers get thrown in the trash can. This is not really what humans are meant for. To spend all of our days paying attention to being late or being too soon or to getting and to spending. So again, a little check mark. I feel that I've mastered that next sentence or independent clause of the poem. We're not going to do every single piece of this poem together here because I don't want the video to last forever and ever. So to move on to my next tip, we're going to skip to, we have given our hearts away a sordid boon. During the warm reading, we absolutely have to look up the words that we don't know. I'd recommend keeping a phone or a dictionary close at hand so that you can look things up. And when you do this, I think rather than getting kind of drowned in the long form definition, annotation-wise, you're better off picking a single synonym that you can then actually replace with your pen on the text. So the word sordid, I'm going to replace with the word sleazy or dirty. And then the word boon, give me a second to look that one up, I'm going to replace with blessing or request. So let's do that here and then reread our sentence because I'm not quite ready to put a check mark here because I haven't finished making sense of the words yet. So our annotated read is going to say, we have given our hearts away a sleazy request. Well, that kind of makes sense. We've given our hearts, our love, our souls away to things like our clocks, our calendars, our bank accounts, our stuff. And this is a very sleazy request. It's a cheap way to live. Now, before we move on to the next tip, I want to go ahead and look up some of the words toward the end of the poem that are going to be very important for a full grasp of its meaning. And that is Proteus and Triton down at the bottom. Just in case you don't remember exactly who those guys are from Greek mythology, Proteus and Triton are both gods associated with the water. And it does seem like our speaker is standing out in nature and looking at some water. And as he does so, he thinks of Proteus, this great sea god rising from the sea. And then he's hearing old Triton blow his wreathed horn. So if you do a nice thorough lookup of Triton, sometimes in addition to a dictionary definition, It might be nice to click on images if you're using your phone to help you out. And we can see some pictures here of Triton blowing his C-shaped horn. When the word that you're looking up is a person or a concrete thing, maybe even a thing that you're not familiar with, then getting an image in your head can always be helpful. And of course, with your handy pen, you are going to make note of that in the margin. So a reread of the final lines might be, having sight of a Greek sea god rising from the sea, or hear the old sea god blow his horn. Moving on to the next annotation tip. There are going to be moments when you're going to be very tempted to put a question mark in the margin and move on because you found something that's really poetically difficult. This is the stuff that makes some people hate poetry or think that they hate poetry. But hang with me a little bit. Maybe if you give poetry just a little bit of time, you might find a few poems that you like, but the best ones are probably going to take a little effort, and of course that's what this warm read is all about. It's about giving the poem a little bit more effort. So, for instance, the sea that bears her bosom to the moon. I'm going to presume we know what a bosom is. We're not going to look it up or pull up any images for the time being. But we're looking at this sentence, all right? So I've made sense of it word-wise. The sea that bears her breasts to the moon. Okay, I understand what the sentence is saying, but it's still weird. I'm still having a hard time of it. So I'm going to ask you this question, and this is something you can ask yourself whenever you hit the really hard stuff. Is it hard because the sentence sounds like a crazy foreign language? If it's to the extent that it feels like a foreign language, yeah, go ahead and put a question mark on it and consult your teacher. Or talk to a poetry lover if this isn't something that you're doing for a class. You can always get help with a poem. Poems are not about sitting in a locked room by yourself and figuring it out by yourself and giving yourself an A or an F. It's about beauty, and hopefully it's about a little bit of enjoyment. So if it feels like a foreign language, okay, move on, get some help. But maybe the issue is not that it's a foreign language problem. Maybe it's just unrealistic. Maybe it makes sense word-wise, but it doesn't make sense realism-wise. And this is so typical for reading great literature, because some literature is fantasy. Imagine if you threw everything in the trash that was fantasy just because you'd never imagined it before, just because it was foreign to you, because it was unfamiliar, because it was unrealistic. You don't want to do that. So is it just figurative? Is it just creative? Is it just a little unrealistic? And I think that's what's happening here. We're talking about something that is not realistic. I, for one, have never watched a sea bear her breasts to the moon because the sea is not literally a woman. So when we come to this kind of difficulty, just the unrealistic difficulty, we're going to ask ourselves, creatively speaking, what do I think the poet really means? And the annotation technique that I'm going to recommend here is a little wavy arrow. The wavy arrow just kind of indicates that I'm going to take a stab at some figurative interpretation here. He's imagining a sea as if she's a woman bearing herself to the moon. This is romantic, y'all. This is sexy and romantic. Who knew that Wordsworth and all this serious, highfalutin language was going to get all sexy and romantic on us? But that's really what he's doing. He's imagining that the sea is a woman at night bearing herself to the moon who's looking down on her. So I'm doing my little wavy line, and I'm going to put a romantic way of thinking about the sea and the nighttime and the moon. Now, what if I'm wrong? What if I've gotten this wrong? So what, y'all? If you want to put a question mark by your interpretation and then take that to a teacher or a poetry expert, great. If you decide in the long run that you've gotten it wrong, guess what? You can scribble it out, you can delete it, you can erase it, you can change your mind. That is always an option. The one thing I don't want you to do when you're reading poetry is to be afraid of it. We're not going to be afraid of a poem, and we're definitely not going to be afraid of making a mistake. Oh, but teacher, I'm afraid of making a mistake on a test or a paper because then I'll get a bad grade. Well, guess what? Before it comes time to take a test or write a paper, you can always ask me, and I will give you some guidance. And that's all there is to it. We do the best that we can, and we enjoy it. And you know, the truth is, figurative, creative stuff like this, the unrealistic stuff, there might be more than one way to look at it. And when it comes time to sit around and talk about the poem, which is kind of what poetry lovers do sometimes, sort of like movie lovers talk about movies after they see the movie, you might find that somebody else has come up with something different and better than yours, and that's great. All right, y'all, let's go ahead and move on. So we have some slash marks between sentences. We have some word definitions. We have some check marks when we figured it out. We have some question marks when we are not so sure, and we have some wavy arrows for when we have done some creative, figurative interpretation. So the next tip is get all the way to the bottom of the poem using this technique, and then go back up to the top, and let's just do a really quick kind of summative header. We're going to give the poem a heading, and we're going to use those classic journalists' words: who, what, when, where, and why. So let's just quick list who. Who is talking to whom? So the speaker here, I'm presuming, is just William Wordsworth. It doesn't always have to be the poet, but in this case, I think it's just the poet. And he's talking to us. The what is he talking about? Well, he's talking about how we're kind of living our lives all wrapped up in stuff that might not matter that much. We're worried about the clock, and we're worried about our bank accounts, and we're not really looking at the world in a romantic way. We're not appreciating nature. We're not letting the world be as magical and as lovely as it can be because we're too worried about timing it and buying stuff. And the why is William Wordsworth writing this poem to us, his audience? I think he wants us to slow down and enjoy this lovely world for all the magic that it has in it. And, you know, that's actually one of the reasons why I chose this poem for this lesson, because that's what poetry does, y'all. Poetry forces you to slow down. At least the warm reading does. And it forces you to just, well, not forces you, that's the wrong word. It invites you. It invites you into something magical and lovely and really quite natural. It's words. It's people communicating to one another in words that are creative and which come from the heart. So that is our who, what, when, where, why heading. Now I'm going to give you a couple more things to do. They're not absolute necessities if you're doing this for yourself, but I think this is going to take you to a really warm, lovely place of fully appreciating the poem. So I'm going to ask you also to underline the most memorable image from the poem. Most poems are thick and rich with images, either visual images or maybe even sounds or tastes, anything that's sensory, anything that gets your imagination going. So I think the moment of imagery that I would underline is going to be that last one with the sea god rising up out of the water And clearly Wordsworth wants us to linger on this amazing kind of mythical, magical image because it's the conclusion, it's the last moment there. And so I'm going to underline this as my favorite, most memorable image of the poem. So in the future, when somebody mentions, "The world is too much with us" with William Wordsworth, this is the picture that's going to come to mind. So underline the picture that you want to come back to your mind in the future when somebody mentions the poem to you. The other thing I want you to underline is one special word. Look through the poem and pick the one word that you think was the most lovely, precise, poetic choice of the poet. You know, poets are concerned with picking perfect words. And so I want you to go through here and pick which word in the poem gets the award for most poetic word choice. And I think that I'm going to choose forlorn. Forlorn means sad, but it's in a sad way, not like I'm crying, but it's like I'm just wishing for better days. It's a word we don't use much anymore. And when you do this particular pick, y'all, you don't have to pick the fanciest word. You don't have to pick an old-fashioned word. You just pick the word that you think is the most perfect word choice, and it can be simple. You might choose something as simple as spending. Maybe that is the most perfect word in the poem because it has to do with spending money and spending your time. But for me, it's forlorn because it just has that wonderful connotation of sadness for a time that I've let slip by, and I wish that I could get it back again. So that one word that you pick for the best word of the poem, you're going to do a double underline. And the last annotation tip I'm going to give you is just to do a little journaling at the bottom. At the header, you have quite a bit of writing with the who, what, when, where, why. And at the bottom, you're going to do a little bit more writing where you just kind of react to the poem. And y'all, if there's not enough room at the bottom of the page, then get your own little poetry journal and write about why you like it. I'm assuming that you're only going to go through a full warm reading with a poem that you like. Warm reading completed. And now here we are at our final costume change and our final phase of reading, what I call the hot read of the poem. And it really has to do with reading it out loud. And this is the passionate, this is the performance level. I told you at the beginning that you're really better off reading the cold read out loud too. But even if you didn't, the third read, the hot read, it has to be out loud because y'all, poems were designed for the voice. They really were. I know that you can sit back and read it to yourself silently, and that's what we think of when we think of reading books. It's a quiet, silent thing. But poetry is supposed to appeal to like every level of your human artistic self. So it has ideas that come to your mind, obviously. But even more than that, it has a sound and it has a feeling. It has a sound and it has a feeling. And one more time, just for emphasis, it has a sound and it has a feeling. And the hot read is where you get really serious and passionate about that sound and that feeling. So how does the poem feel? You got to get zoned into the mood and to the tone. How does William Wordsworth feel as he delivers us this poem? And I think I would say he's earnest, he's passionate, he's insistent that we listen to him. I can tell because he says, "Great God," with that big exclamation point. He would rather give up his 1800s English Christianity and be a pagan Greek in an outworn, old-fashioned, false creed or religion than keep on living this worldly, obsessive, getting and spending late and soon kind of lifestyle. So I think our emotion here is going to have to be really passionate and a little, forlorn. A little forlorn and passionate. The other thing we want to do is we want to pay attention to the sound of it. Are there rhymes that we want to emphasize? And there certainly are. This is a sonnet, so we want to pay attention to the pattern of the poem. Are there places where we want to pause, like in addition to the punctuation? And part of this musical sound aspect is we want to pay attention to the rhythm. The rhythm is really important. So let's analyze the rhythm for a minute before we get into our hot read. Here's how the poem sounds with an extra and ridiculous focus on the rhythm. The world is too much with us late and soon. Getting and spending we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. It's a little irregular, but there are some lines that have that nice, even iambic pentameter that I'm sure you remember studying in your Shakespeare classes. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. Ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So we want to recognize that that's there. That's part of the artistry. But we're not going to read it like that because we're not nitwits. But we want to notice. We want to notice the rhythm. We want to notice the rhyme. We might want to notice the alliteration. Basically, we're going to take a few extra minutes to look at things that have to do with sound, rhythm, and feeling. And then we're going to practice a few times. And the final hot reading is the one that is basically a rehearsed performance. So here, to kind of close out our lesson, I'm going to give you my hot read, my performance read of The World is Too Much With Us by William Wordsworth. Always give the title and the poet. The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. The sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not. Great God, I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. So might I, standing on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn. Have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton blow his wreathed horn. And that's the hot read of my poem, and that's kind of the goal. And if you wanted to take it even a little further, the poems you really love, you can memorize and be ready to recite at a moment's notice, which is a fantastic party trick. I'm sure you'll agree. Thank you for hanging around for this very long video. I hope it's been helpful. Be prepared now to do lots of cold reads, a handful of warm reads, and a few really special hot reads when the situation or the party asks for it. Before you go, here is one final screen with a recap of the warm read or annotating tips from earlier in the video. And be advised, this is definitely not the only way you can annotate a poem. Please feel free to improvise to whatever extent you want to. But these particular tips are nice and concrete, they're systematic, They cover all the various different English classy sorts of things you might end up talking about in a class discussion or a paper or a test. So it'll work for you, and it's a really, really good place to start.